Previously in Hedge Knights, Sapo and Megahoof returned home after testing the protective clothing to see how well it actually protected against pollution. After making the rounds to check on everyone's health, Sapo realized that Tangier was pregnant and let her know in private. A massive harvest started for the crops in the farm field, requiring Klein, Bash, and Shellbell to help. Megahoof solidified the plan to explore the ruins as he set to depart with Madzi and Dave around the 1st of autumn. Episode 38: The Open Road. The castle was abuzz with nervous excitement. The new clothing that Klein and Lazarus had tailored allowed the Adlets to more freely explore the main continent, something that hadn't been possible until now. While the trip itself might be fraught with dangers, at least the risk of succumbing to pollution exposure had been addressed. While the three explorers were away, the rest of the Adlets hoped to harvest the entire Psychoid field and enclose it so that it could be used for bison grazing. The orchard of salix trees were enabling the Adlets to cleanse the soil at a rate never obtainable before, so it might even be possible to grow outside of the castle walls next spring. Megahoof suggested to both Dave and Madzi that they don their protective clothing to get accustomed to its fit, and also to allow Lazarus to make alterations if it was needed. Lazarus had already altered one of the sets for Madzi, as she was smaller than the adult size that was originally tailored. Dave found the clothing to be itchy and stifling, and worried he wouldn't be able to properly sleep in the garbs while out on the open road. He pulled and tugged at the hems, cuffs, and collars, hoping to adjust it so it would both fit and be comfortable. He asked Lazarus if there was anything he could do about how it was so irritating, and Lazarus shrugged and suggested maybe he ought to take a proper bath, but Dave actually nodded at the suggestion. Megahoof also reminded Madzi to get used to sleeping during the night, so all three could travel more easily together. Madzi was used to being a night owl, but she could suffer the midday sun if it meant going on an adventure. Lazarus yelled to Bash that he had finally finished his woodcutting axe and that he could fetch it from the weapons rack. He had just ascended from the slate mines with Madzi and was eager to try the axe while harvesting Maki and Psychoid in the fields. Megahoof wanted to distill 6 hybrid extracts before departing for the ruins. He knew it was both unlikely and probably rather unsafe for anyone left in the castle to actually depart for salix trees, as they'd be short 3 archers for defense. But he was also concerned about the potential for ambrosia to spoil if it wasn't used soon. Despite having written up extensive notes about proper distillation, nobody else in the castle had the chemistry skills to follow the directions, so it was up to Megahoof to fulfill them. Despite neither of the boys having any serious interest in cooking, both Megahoof and Sapo requested their help, because the amount of wheat and tea leaves that needed to be processed far exceeded what Sapo could manage alone. Sapo was careful about explaining the steps and safety precautions when brewing tea leaves. Too strong of a batch could be potentially dangerous, so measuring the weight of the batch was paramount. Milling wheat on the quern was much easier in comparison, and doubled as a way for the rambunctious boys to burn up excess energy. With the newest fungal cap harvest from the Nutrifungus farm, Tangier and Judea pulled hay from the shelves so that they could stockpile fungal caps instead, as they spoiled significantly faster than the hay. The boys practiced harvesting fungal caps in the dark and gloomy Nutrifungal farm. They were told of the importance of the fungal cap back where their parents were born, and how much the Adlets of Hillenor Island relied upon them. In a way, harvesting fungal caps was a rite of passage for Hillenor Adlets. Almost every able-bodied Adlet on the island was taught to harvest caps while growing up. the boys treated their newly acquired tools with an unusual maturity and took more care harvesting the caps, knowing the bison relied upon them for survival. While Judea hauled the fungus to the shelves, she worried that the abundant harvest would exceed the pantry's capacity and raised the issue with Tangier. Tangier took stock of the pantry and agreed that they'd likely need to expand the pantry walls to accommodate the extra crop, or they'd risk losing much of it to rot or vermin. They were both currently juggling too many tasks, but promised to circle back towards the project later. Megahoof offered some encouraging words to Sappho, hoping to ease the burden of work laid upon his shoulders. Both bison pens had been restocked with fresh mushrooms and the darkened plot replanted. Megahoof discussed expanding the dedicated farm into 2 plots that had heel root zone, and also even southward, encroaching on the wheat once the wheat field was barren. Perhaps the bison wouldn't need to rely upon fungal caps so much if they were offered grazing land. Transitioning the bison away from having to eat hay would free the cooks of the castle from having to mill wheat by hand, which would be a massive relief. Madsy attempted to sleep at a normal time, heeding Megahoof's request, but try as she might, she just couldn't. She awoke and was surprised to see Bash traipsing around the castle halls. She headed to the mines, but not to carve away at the walls of her secret room, but to stash some personal items so that nobody else would intrude. It was easy to hide stuff down in the dark slate tunnels she knew quite well. While returning back towards the surface, she was surprised to see Shellbell waiting at the headframe, wanting to go into the tunnels with her. Shellbell asked why she didn't have her mining pick with her, and she scrambled to find a better answer than that she had forgotten. But before she could think up of an excuse, Shellbell said that he just wanted to go exploring in the dark. Megahoof saw that Madsy was already awake and asked whether she actually tried to sleep. She nodded as well as she could in a heavy cloak, and Megahoof quietly replied, "I know, me too. Too excited to sleep well." She asked when they'd be heading out. The midnight moon marked the start of autumn. Megahoof told her once the others were awake, they'd bid their farewells, pack, and depart. It reminded him to request some bedrolls made by his wife so they'd sleep more comfortably. With Dave awake, the trio started to bid their goodbyes. It was particularly difficult for Bash to process. He was used to Megahoof departing for a day or two to fetch Salix trees, but never for an entire season, and that felt so scary to him. The other islets did their best to reassure young Bash that he'd be back with shiny treasures and ancient tomes, but Bash could sense the gravity and danger of their mission. Dave took a spare map and roughly charted the route he intended to take in case anyone needed to find them. The plan was the same as when they traveled to Pennacook, avoiding major roads and sticking to deep forest as much as possible. It would make their trip take considerably longer, but was the far safer option than dealing with packs of roaming visitors. The trio checked up on their clothing, gear, medicine, and provisions to make sure everything was in order, as there was no room for mistakes when so far from the castle. Extra provisions were stuffed into their rucksacks in case the voyage took longer than expected, or in the event that they had extra mouths to feed, like they did when they found Klein. Lazarus handed Megahoof some spare bowstrings and a tightly woven bag that he said when folded and closed properly, it would be watertight to keep maps and some food dry, even if they had to wade in deep water. The early morning breeze helped cool the bundled travelers as they trekked westward along the southern border of the tiny boreal forest they called home. Dave and Madsy shared fun stories of the rise of forest, making sure to keep their voices low and in hushed tones to listen for nearby raiders. Luckily, the raiding visitors were almost always armor-clad and marched with leaded feet, usually audible far beyond even the sharpest of eyes. Back in the castle, everyone else was racing against time to harvest, clean, sort, pack, and store the bundles of maki, tea, and hill root. Sapo promised to make a feast once the farm fields were cleared, an encouragement that put some real wind into everyone's sails. The boys were enjoying their time cooking, brewing, and milling in the kitchen, a welcome change of pace from crop tending. Dave thought that trekking through the foothills just south of the Catraro forest would help cover their tracks so as to not be followed by raiding parties that picked up on their trail. Hill climbing fully geared and carrying a season's worth of provisions was no easy task. The trio crested yet another rolling hill and saw a creature that was seldom seen in the Catraro forest. It was a green and yellow herbivore, covered it in painful-looking malignant growths. Dave said that their meat was still relatively safe to eat, but you had to be very careful hunting them, because when they died, they outgassed poisons and you had to wait for it to dissipate. Megahoof wondered why they were never seen only a day's travel to the north, while Madzi felt pity for the poor creature. The 2 hillroot fields had finally been harvested, so Judea and Tangier wasted no time to prepare to enclose the fields and add them to the fungal farm. They flattened out where the rows of crops were once sown to make way for a new slate wall to run alongside the windmill boardwalk. They asked if the remaining wheat in the field could be harvested a little early, so they could expand southward during the renovation, and Sapo and Shellbell quickly reaped the remaining wheat to make room. Lazarus asked Sapo if he thought it made sense to reorganize the farm fields the following spring, aligning the crops in a better layout of rows to make it easier to traverse, sow, and harvest. As the farm grew, it sprawled rather haphazardly, making use of new purified soil as it became available, with little in the way of careful layout planning. The 2 experienced farmers agreed that clearing the entire farm field and then carefully planning plots for the following year would allow them to organize much more effectively. An acrid blanket of smog befell the glade, and despite the Adlet's best efforts to purify the soil, there was little that could be done about the weather. They had theorized the smog was brought in from the smokestacks from the strange metallic buildings that spewed pollution into the air, but it could also be dust and debris kicked up by storms sent aloft into the sky to settle elsewhere. Judea hoped the travelers were spared from the smog. Sleeping outdoors was harsh enough. Under a thick cloak of smog, it would be miserable. In spotting what Dave called a toxalope, it got Megahoof wondering what other sorts of creatures still managed to survive out beyond their boundary walls. Various creatures had attacked their castle, ones that weren't twisted and vile like the waste rats or toxalopes, and that might even mean they were significantly large purified glades, ones large enough to support an entire ecosystem. If predators like bears or hyenas still survived, it likely meant that much of the food web was also intact. He found it to be quite strange that apart from the feral pack of bloodthirsty animals that prowled around the castle, nobody had ever seen them in the wild. The thick fur of the bears they had killed were best suited for frigid climates, whereas the hyenas had bristly, thin hair, much better suited for sun-soaked savannas. Then he asked a quizzical question to both Madsy and Dave. Had they ever witnessed visitors attacking animals? In all the times visitors beset the castle, they had only ever killed animals if the animals were already feral and nipping at their heels. But apart from that, it seemed visitors were only out to kill adlets, leaving the animals entirely alone. Dave and Madsy pondered for a few solid minutes, and Dave broke the silence. You know what? I don't think I've ever seen visitors kill animals. Strange that they're only after us, isn't it? Madsy shook her head in agreement. Magoof wondered if the visitors created all of the pollution just to kill off the adlets, and the animals were just collateral damage in their genocidal attempts. The motivations of the visitors were still just such a mystery, and all of the first-hand accounts around the time of first contact had been mostly lost in the initial invasion, leaving the mystery to be pieced together by people like Megahoof. The new walls for the enclosed farm were constructed, complete with a slate shale roof. Judea and Tangier carefully removed the old walls, leaving behind some load-bearing sections to support the weight of the roof, until they could build proper columns in their place. They hadn't yet expanded into the western plot where hill root once was sown, but that was next on their list of projects to undertake once the pantry expansion was done. The trio arrived at the first major road they'd have to bypass. They rested a while, with the road lying just within their horizon, waiting to observe if there were visitors around. After Dave deemed it to be safe, they steeled themselves for the ensuing sprint across the road, to disappear into the woods on the other side, and then to backtrack a little to throw pursuers off their tracks. It was easy to be lulled into complacency when accustomed to the strong, safe walls of the castle, but anyone who had survived long enough deep within visitor-occupied territory knew that complacency was lethal. Dave's cautious habits to regularly backtrack, carefully observe empty roads, using shallow water to hide tracks and scent trails, bearing waste and refuse, and to take more rugged terrain, were what separated a veteran pathfinder such as himself from becoming a visitor's next victim. As soon as the renovations were complete, Lazarus and Sappho took to the fields to quickly sow spores. Sappho was tired of milling by hand, and he told the others to start using the windmill to process the wheat, meaning they'd no longer be growing a stockpile of hay. Not having to mill by hand was motivation enough to drive Sappho to sow spores as quickly as he could, to provide a steady supply of caps for the bison. The next project was a little more urgent. The shelves of the pantry were nearing capacity, and the crops were still left out in the fields. Judea and Tangier decided not to take the resources and time to build the heavier castle walls meant for defense as they once did, when they lacked boundary and border walls. Simple slate walls would easily suffice. The smog hadn't relented, and they both agreed to wait in hopes it would pass. Everyone preferred to stay indoors as much as possible during the rolling smogs, shuttering the windows and trying to keep as much of the acidic and foul air outside as possible. It was unfortunate they couldn't source enough blended fabric for hoods for everyone to wear, but there was still a little gossypium left in the fields, so perhaps another hood or two might be possible to protect the builders when they worked outdoors. Tangier's morning sickness made it even more unpleasant to be out in the smog, so Judea told her to rest up. She'd build the simple enclosure herself. While she was at it, she planned to tackle the last of the fungal field renovation as well, so as the days got cooler, she could relax and get back to teaching Shellbell and Bash. Despite being offered bed rest, Tangier saw that the outside walls were already finished, and the fresh scent of wheat and mackie in the pantry actually helped her nausea. So she worked to dismantle the old castle walls and build a pantry floor out of aged timber. Most of the crops had been harvested from the field, and Sappho and the boys worked on the massive backlog of brewing and cooking. Tangier reminded Sappho of his promise to cook a feast. Sappho hadn't forgotten. His paws were dyed a greenish brown from all the cycloid brewing, and offered Tangier a freshly brewed tea while she waited for the meal. The bison were huddled in the tiny barn to avoid the acidic smog, as the salix trees slowly absorbed the additional pollution brought into the glade via the cruel winds. One of the most dangerous crossings on the trio's journey lied just ahead of them, an ancient wide roadway known to be used by visitor raiding parties to traverse the Ryza forest. The land around the road was flat and the trees in the forest were sparse, leaving the adlets open and exposed. Haste and caution were often seen as opposing forces, but the trio needed to use both in equal measure. The adlets back in the castle were coping with the prolonged acidic smog and preparing for winter by reconstructing hearths and stockpiling food, hoping the traveling trio's weather and luck was faring better. Thank you for watching Hedge Knights, Episode 38, The Open Road. If you would like to support me as a content creator, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. If you would like to support me more directly, a link to Patreon can be found in the description of this video. Thank you so very much for watching, and a special thank you to my Patreon patrons, Twitch subscribers, and viewers like you that support the channel. I hope to catch you next episode. Farewell, fellow adlets.